King James Bible, Matthew 5:18. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law till all is fulfilled. This is Jesus talking. He's referring to when he comes back a second time as being the fulfillment of the law, of the prophecy. He's referring to the Old Testament. He's saying that nothing in the Old Testament becomes null and void until all is fulfilled, the prophecy of him coming back, basically the book of Revelation. Until that is fulfilled, not one jot or one tittle shall pass from the law. Matthew 5:18. And yet, the law, as described in the Old Testament, which is the law that Jesus followed. Jesus was a Jew. When he refers to the law, he's talking about the Old Testament. The New Testament it doesn't even exist at this time. The law is what he stands up and preaches. The law is what he went and instructed religious leaders when he was 12 years old. When he refers to the law, he's talking about the Old Testament. He's talking about all the rules described in the Old Testament. Jesus coming to earth and dying for the sins of mankind. The only thing that changed about the Old Testament was it ceased to make sacrificing animals necessary. Because of Jesus' death and his sacrifice, sacrificing animals is no longer necessary. That is the only part of the Old Testament law described in the Old Testament that changes because of Jesus coming to earth. Everything else, according to this verse, spoken by Jesus, is to not change one bit until his second coming, and all is fulfilled. So let's see what laws in the Old Testament we no longer obey. But according to Jesus here, we should have never stopped obeying because it should not be changed. We are no longer stoning people to death for breaking the Sabbath and working on the Sabbath. That's one of the laws in the Old Testament. A man was stoned to death by the tribe of Israel when he was caught picking up sticks on the Sabbath. God commanded that he be stoned to death. Insolent children who disobey and are rude to their parents should be taken in front of the whole town and stoned to death. Girls, not boys, just girls, who are found to be not virgins on their wedding night are to be stoned to death. Witches and gays are to be killed. Those are only a few of the laws in the Old Testament that we no longer follow because it's not convenient. It doesn't go against our idea of what is right and wrong. So what's this guy say about the Old Testament versus the New Testament?
The Christian story, we're Christians, we're New Testament people. There was an evolution in the Old Testament. There are some awful things there. It developed. The notion of God was purified as it went through the Old Testament.
The notion of God was purified. Isn't that interesting? Okay, how is the notion of God purified? Does that mean that everything that God did in the Old Testament, the mass genocide and infanticide and commanding 3,200 virgins be taken as the spoils of war for the Israelite soldiers after first having to watch their families get massacred? God ordering pregnant women cut open with swords and their little ones dashed to pieces on rocks? God hardening Pharaoh's heart so that when Moses asked him to let his people go. Pharaoh said no, and that allowed God to continue to punish Egypt. It's kind of a strange story. God hardens Pharaoh's heart so he can punish Pharaoh's people, and ultimately punish Pharaoh and kill Pharaoh's son and everybody else's firstborn. Apparently, all that is, we're just supposed to forget all that, because the idea of God is purified. And after Jesus comes, we're all supposed to start believing now that God is only loving and merciful and kind and compassionate. And we're just supposed to forget all the qualities that this God shows in the Old Testament, how he is so bigoted. Every other society that gets in his way doesn't matter. Only the Jewish society matters to God. Everybody else, they're nothing. They're just to be cast aside when God leads his people to the promised land. All the societies that were there before are all just, it's okay to wipe them out completely. I'm sorry, it just seems a little bit strange that this guy who's a leader of the Christian religion is saying that the idea of God was purified. And yes, God did some really horrible things in the Old Testament, but we're just supposed to, we're New Testament people. We don't look at the Old Testament. We just ignore that. That was then and this is now. Oh, but don't forget, everything in the Bible is inspired by God and from the mind of God. We just don't look at the Old Testament. We're New Testament people. So half of what God tells us we ignore, because we're New Testament people, and we only like to think about God as a nice, loving God. And that was before, God, he was PMSing or something back then. He had some problems mentally, but he got better. And so we just look at the good, nice, warm, fuzzy God that came along after Jesus,